She was only 7, too young to understand why her mother cried behind locked doors, too small to stop the cold silence that swallowed their home each night. And then there was Roan, a battered old German shepherd, standing alone at the gate of an empty house, one leg dragging, one eye watching. No one spoke to him, but she did, with crumbs in her pocket and a heart too full of loneliness. What does it take for two broken souls to recognize each other in a world that no longer listens? Eugene, Oregon, always seemed a little tired in November. The sky rarely opened, the clouds hung low like old curtains, and the sidewalks stayed damp long after the rain had stopped. It didn't snow much here, just a steady drizzle that settled into the bones of the city. The air was cold but not cruel, and the wind moved gently through the trees as if careful not to disturb the stillness of certain homes. One of those homes sat at the very end of Elliott Street, where the houses got smaller, the grass grew wilder, and the mailboxes leaned like old men too proud to fall. In that final house, a faded blue one with a sagging porch and a yard full of stubborn weeds, lived a girl named Lila Monroe. Lila was 7 years old, though she often felt older, like someone who had overheard too many grown-up silences. She was small, with a thin frame and knobby knees, her hair the color of dry leaves tied back in a short ponytail that never stayed neat. Her clothes were always a little too big, especially the yellow raincoat she wore nearly every day, regardless of the weather. It had once belonged to no one in particular, just something left behind in a church donation box. But Lila had claimed it, and the coat, like her, had learned to live quietly in the corners of things. She had never known her father. Her mother, Sarah Monroe, had raised her alone since birth. There was no whispered name, no photograph tucked in a drawer, no bedtime story about a man who once held her hand. Lila bore only her mother's last name, a name that felt both ordinary and sad when teachers read it out loud. Sarah was 33, tall and once graceful, now weighed down by a quiet grief that had no beginning and no obvious end. She used to be a warm woman with a soft laugh and a fondness for painting tiny flowers on ceramic mugs. But over time, the laughter had disappeared, the paints had dried out, and Sarah had folded into herself like paper left in the rain. She suffered from chronic depression, though Lila didn't know the words for it, only that her mother often stayed in her room with the lights off, the door closed, and the television murmuring endlessly behind it. The house was a museum of things left undone. Dust lay thick on the piano that no one played. The living room smelled faintly of forgotten coffee and damp upholstery. In the kitchen, dishes sat untouched, and the calendar hadn't been changed since July. Lila learned how to make her own cereal, toast her own bread, brush her own hair, and fold her own silence into the silence of the house. The neighbors noticed, in the way neighbors sometimes do. Mrs. Calloway, who lived across the street, often peeked through her curtains and muttered things like, "Poor thing," under her breath. Mr. Tilden, who walked his dog twice a day, once offered Lila a candy bar and asked if her mom was okay. But when Lila answered with a small nod and an even smaller smile, he didn't press. No one did. It was on one of those quiet afternoons, when the sky was the color of wet cement and the ground smelled of earth and rust, that Lila saw him. She was walking home from school, as usual, her backpack swinging slightly with every step. The air was heavy, the trees bare, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. As she passed the old Jenkins house, long abandoned and half swallowed by ivy, she paused. Behind the rusted iron gate stood a dog. He was a German shepherd, large and weathered, with a coat mottled by dirt and time. His fur had once been rich black and tan, but now carried streaks of gray along his neck and muzzle. One ear stood tall, the other drooped, and his left side bore a faint limp, barely noticeable but somehow sorrowful. His eyes, however, were what stopped Lila in her tracks, deep golden brown, and watching her with an alertness that felt almost human. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't move. He simply stood there, like a statue carved from caution and memory. Lila stared back. There was no fear, no words, just a kind of recognition, like two strangers who'd somehow met before. The next day, he was there again, and the day after that. Lila never approached too closely. She stayed on the sidewalk, sometimes slowing her steps, sometimes glancing without turning her head. The dog never advanced, never retreated. He was always there, in the same spot, behind the crooked gate of the house that no one wanted. 3 days passed before she brought him something. It was half a sandwich, peanut butter, flattened from her backpack, wrapped in a wrinkled napkin. She knelt near the gate, slid it just inside, and walked away without looking back. The next afternoon it was gone, so she brought more. A slice of apple, a handful of dry cereal, a piece of leftover toast. She never spoke, never tried to touch him, never crossed the gate. But the dog, whom she began to call Roan, though she never said it aloud, waited for her now. He didn't wag his tail or make a sound, but his eyes followed her in a way that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, seen. Once, as she crouched to leave a cracker near the fence, Mrs. Calloway called from her porch, "You shouldn't feed that mutt, sweetheart. You don't know where he's been." Lila didn't answer. She simply tucked her hands in her coat and kept walking. At home, Sarah hadn't noticed anything new. The door stayed closed. The light beneath it remained dim. But Lila had started drawing again, something she hadn't done since kindergarten. Crumpled pages scattered across her room, all filled with sketches of a dog standing behind a gate. Sometimes she drew herself beside him, not smiling, just standing, just not alone. She didn't know where he came from, or why he chose that house, or what made him stay. But every afternoon, no matter how cold the wind blew or how gray the sky became, she walked by that house. And every time, Roan was there, waiting. By the 4th week, the dog had become a fixture, like the rusted mailbox in front of the Jenkins house or the ivy clinging to the broken chimney. To the rest of the neighborhood, he was still nothing more than a shadow behind a gate. But to Lila, he was something else entirely. She had named him Roan. The name came from a storybook she had once read in the school library about a forgotten knight who guarded a ruined castle no one remembered. Roan had no sword, no armor, and no kingdom. But he watched the world like someone who had lost everything and still refused to abandon his post. The dog's stillness reminded her of that night, unmoving, quiet, yet undeniably present. She never spoke the name out loud. She only whispered it in her mind, like a secret. Roan began to notice her earlier in the day. She would catch the gleam of his eyes through the vines even before she reached the gate. He no longer waited for her to pass before stepping forward. Instead, he began standing just behind the fence by the time she turned the corner of Elliott Street. His head slightly lowered, his ears alert. There was no wagging tail, no excited bark. Just his presence, solid and dependable. One Thursday afternoon, as Lila crossed the schoolyard toward the main gate, 3 older kids, 2 boys and a girl, stood waiting by the fence. They were 5th graders, loud and lanky, with oversized jackets and scuffed sneakers. The biggest of the 3, a boy named Trevor, had a habit of throwing pencil erasers at younger kids when the teachers weren't looking. Lila recognized him instantly and tightened her grip on her backpack strap. "Hey!" Trevor called out, his voice high and mocking. "You're the weird girl, right? The one who talks to that creepy dog?" The other 2 snickered. Lila didn't answer. She lowered her gaze and kept walking. "Don't ignore me," Trevor barked, stepping into her path. "You feeding that monster behind the Jenkins place? Gonna get yourself bit, you know." Lila tried to slip past, but Trevor's arm shot out, knocking her backpack off her shoulder. It landed on the pavement with a soft thud. The laughter behind him grew louder. Lila reached for the bag, but Trevor's foot landed on it before she could grab it. "I'm just saying, someone should call animal control," he said with a cruel grin. "Probably full of diseases." Then there was silence, a different kind of silence. Lila saw it in their faces before she turned. Trevor's smirk faltering, the girl's eyes wide, the second boy backing away with a quiet gasp. She turned slowly and saw Roan. He had crossed the street. No one saw him leave the gate. No one heard him approach. But there he was, standing just behind Lila, his broad frame steady, his amber eyes locked on Trevor, with a stare that seemed to cut straight through whatever bluster the boy had. Roan didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than a roar. Trevor stepped back, muttered something incoherent, and broke into a stiff jog down the sidewalk. The other 2 followed, nearly tripping over each other. Lila didn't move for a moment. She could feel Roan's breath behind her, warm and steady, like the beat of a drum. She turned. He was already walking away, crossing the street with a slow, uneven gait, back to the gate, back to the shadows. He didn't look back. That night, as Lila lay in bed, she drew a new picture, Roan standing between her and three faceless shapes. She sketched the word guardian in block letters beneath it, and just below that, she wrote for the first time, Roan the Silent Night. The next day, Roan was back in his usual place. Nothing had changed in his posture, his face, or his stance. But something had changed in Lila. She felt safer walking past him now, as if she were walking past someone who had already chosen to stand with her. That weekend, an old woman sitting on her porch across the street took notice. Mavis Green, 83 years old, short, round-shouldered, with hair the color of powdered snow, had lived on Elliott Street longer than anyone else. Her porch was her observatory. From a creaky rocking chair, wrapped in a floral shawl and sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug, she watched the world pass by with the same stern expression every day. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and was quick to dismiss foolishness with a grunt and a roll of her sharp blue eyes. But even Mavis, who claimed to mind her own business and preferred it that way, had started to notice the girl and the dog. She had seen the quiet exchanges, the bread passed through the fence, the moments of shared stillness, and now she had seen the dog leave the gate. That, in particular, disturbed her. "Old dogs don't move unless they have reason," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else, as she watched Lila from behind her thick glasses. That afternoon, she stopped Lila with a single sharp call as the girl passed. "You there, girl?" Lila paused, surprised. No one ever spoke to her like that. Mavis squinted at her, the sunlight catching the lines on her face. "That dog, the one behind Jenkins' place. You know him?" Lila shifted her weight and said nothing. "Of course you don't," Mavis muttered. "No one really does. Been there for months, just showed up one day. Folks say he's dangerous, but he's never bothered me. Just sits, watches, like he's waiting." She took a long sip from her mug and leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Be careful, child. Dogs like that, they've seen too much." Lila gave a small nod and moved on, clutching a wrapped slice of turkey sandwich in her coat pocket. At the gate, Roan stood as always. His tail didn't wag. His expression didn't change. But when Lila placed the sandwich through the bars, his eyes softened. Just for a moment. Then he stepped forward, took the food gently, and retreated. She sat on the curb for a while, watching him as the clouds gathered above. She didn't know who had hurt him. She didn't know why he limped. But she knew what he was now. He was hers. Not to own, not to leash, but to trust. And for a girl who had never had anything stay, that was more than enough. The rain came without warning. By nightfall, Eugene was soaked in sheets of silver. Gutters overflowed, the streets shimmered with puddles that rippled with every drop, and the wind lashed tree branches against darkened windows. The Jenkins house, already a silhouette of neglect, seemed to melt further into the storm. Water poured from its broken gutters and pooled around the base of the rusted front gate. Behind that gate, somewhere in the shadows, Roan did not move. Lila hadn't seen him that day. When she passed the house after school, the space behind the fence was empty. That had never happened before. She had left a strip of jerky beneath the gate anyway, though her stomach churned. Maybe he was just hiding from the rain. Maybe he had found somewhere warmer. But something inside her felt wrong. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside her window, and her room flickered with the dance of passing headlights and the occasional burst of lightning. The air in the house was damp and cold. Down the hall, her mother's door was closed. As always, the faint sound of the television murmuring through the wood. Sarah had been unusually quiet even for her, emerging only once that day to pour herself a glass of water before retreating again into the dark. Sarah Monroe, though still only in her early 30s, looked worn down by years of invisible battles. Her once bright features had dulled into pallor, her hair unbrushed, her posture slack like a house half collapsed. She rarely spoke now, and when she did, it was often to the flickering television or to someone Lila could not see. Depression had taken her, not in a single wave, but in the erosion of time, a slow fade. Some days she remembered to hug her daughter. Most days she did not. Lila curled beneath her thin blanket, the fabric rough against her chin. The storm was loud, but louder than the wind, louder than the thunder, was the emptiness behind the gate. She slipped out of bed. The rain slapped her face the moment she stepped outside. Her yellow coat did little to protect her, the water soaking through within seconds. The streetlights buzzed and hummed under the downpour. She ran. The Jenkins house loomed out of the storm, its shape barely visible. As she neared the gate, she saw it. Something lying just beyond the weeds, slumped against the porch steps. "Roan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. She pushed the gate, which creaked open on its rusted hinges. She had never entered before. Her shoes sank into the mud, but she didn't care. Roan was lying on his side, his chest rising and falling shallowly. His front left leg was twisted at a sickening angle, his fur matted with dirt and blood. One of his eyes was swollen shut. When she touched his side, he didn't lift his head, only let out a low, broken sound that made her heart crack in two. "Roan!" she repeated, louder now, tears mixing with rain. She didn't know what to do. She had no phone, no car, no one she could wake, except one. Lila ran barefoot now, coat flapping like a cape behind her, water slapping at her ankles. She turned up the walkway of a house just 2 doors down from her own, the home of Mavis Green, the old woman who always watched from her porch. The lights were off, but Lila banged on the door anyway. It took a minute before she heard movement, then a gruff voice behind the wood. "Who in the devil?" The door opened to reveal Mavis in a long gray nightgown, her white hair pulled back in a braid. She squinted into the rain. "Child?" Her voice softened. "What on earth?" "It's Roan," Lila cried. "He's hurt. Please, please help." For a second, Mavis just stared, but then her mouth set in a hard line. "Get inside. I'll get the truck." 15 minutes later, they were back at the Jenkins house. Mavis's pickup rumbled with age, but it held together as they hoisted Roan, wet, groaning, barely conscious, into the blanket-covered back seat. Lila sat beside him, her hand resting on his soaked fur the entire way. "We're going to see someone I used to know," Mavis said, her voice low over the rattle of rain on the windshield. They drove across town to the edge of a wooded neighborhood, where the houses were farther apart and the trees taller. Mavis pulled into a gravel driveway in front of a small, squat building with a crooked sign that read, "Thatcher Veterinary Closed." The porch light flicked on as they approached. The door opened before Mavis knocked. Arthur Thatcher was a man in his late 60s, with thick white eyebrows and a deeply lined face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He was broad-shouldered but slightly stooped, wearing a flannel shirt, suspenders, and old corduroy trousers. His eyes, gray and sharp, widened when he saw the bundle in the truck. "What the hell, Mavis? I need you to look at him," she said. "I haven't touched a patient in years." "I don't care," Arthur grumbled, but his hands were already moving, guiding Roan onto a steel table in the back room. Lila hovered in the corner, drenched and shivering, watching silently as Arthur examined the leg, checked the eyes, listened to the heart. "He's lucky," Arthur said finally. "Bad fracture. Looks like a solid kick to the foreleg. Older injuries too, some healed scars. He's been through it." Lila stepped forward. "Can you fix him?" Arthur didn't answer right away. His eyes, suddenly thoughtful, were fixed on the dog's face. Then he said, "Where did you find him?" "Behind the Jenkins house," Mavis replied. "He's been there for weeks, watching." Arthur didn't move. Slowly he reached for a cabinet and pulled down a wooden box, old and covered in dust. He opened it gently. Inside were photographs, letters, and a worn patch bearing a military insignia. He pulled out one photo, a younger man in uniform, kneeling beside a German shepherd. His name was Ellis, Arthur said. "My son, killed in Afghanistan. This dog was his. He was part of their K9 unit. After Ellis died, the dog went missing during transport. I never found out what happened to him." He looked at Roan again. "It's him." Mavis laid a hand on Arthur's arm. Her eyes, usually sharp as ice, were soft now. "He came back. Maybe not to you, but to someone who needed him." Arthur nodded once, then turned back to the table. "I'll fix him." Lila exhaled for the first time in hours. Her knees buckled a little, but she didn't let go of Roan's paw. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the small room, something steady had begun again. A quiet thrum of breath, a flicker of hope, the first step toward healing. The rain had passed, but the cold lingered. Eugene awoke under a pale, brittle sky, the kind that promised more gray before it ever gave way to blue. The streets still shimmered with leftover puddles, and the trees stood bare, their limbs stretching like thin arms into the morning air. At the edge of town, in a small weathered house behind a crooked picket fence, Roan lay on a thick blanket, leg bandaged and eyes half closed, breathing deeply. Arthur Thatcher watched him from the doorway of the exam room, arms crossed over his flannel shirt, jaw set in that permanent line between suspicion and awe. It had been nearly a decade since he last touched a surgical tool. Since Ellis. Since the flag-draped box. But when he saw the dog, something had stirred. Not in his hands, they still moved with the precision of a younger man. But deeper, in a place he had buried beneath years of grief and unanswered letters. Now, Roan was here. Somehow, impossibly, he had come back. In the corner of the room, curled into a mismatched armchair, sat Lila, wrapped in a towel Mavis had packed in the truck. Her shoes were drying near the heater. Her damp hair clung to her forehead, and she cradled a book in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. Arthur cleared his throat. "He'll need rest," he said. 2 weeks, maybe more. No running, no stairs. That leg's fragile, and he's older than he looks." Lila nodded. "Can I help?" He paused. "You already did." From that morning forward, the old veterinary clinic became a sanctuary. Lila began visiting every afternoon after school. She would slip in through the side gate, always carrying something. A crumpled drawing, a box of saltines, a small flower she picked from the roadside. Roan, though slow and stiff, would lift his head when he heard her steps. She spoke softly to him, calling him Daddy Dog when Arthur wasn't listening. The name had come to her the night of the storm, when he had laid so still and yet so stubbornly alive. He felt like something more than a pet, more than a protector. He felt like someone who chose her. Roan was healing, but not just in body. The stiffness in his joints slowly lessened. The tremors that had once flickered through his paws when he slept began to fade. Lila would sit cross-legged beside him, reading aloud from storybooks, fairy tales, nature facts, even old newspaper clippings Mavis had saved from her kitchen drawer. When her throat was dry, she would hum instead, and sometimes Roan would sigh, deep and slow, as if the sound was familiar. Arthur watched this quietly. He never said much, only gave her clean towels and warmed salt water for Roan's leg. He had built a soft ramp at the front step, so Roan wouldn't have to climb. He repaired a broken space heater and placed it near the dog's bed. And in the evenings, after Lila left, he would sit beside Roan himself, fingers tracing the patch of scar tissue just above the old dog's ribs, the place where shrapnel had once lodged. Arthur had been a hard man most of his life. Raised on a farm, joined the army at 17, built a veterinary practice with his bare hands. His only softness had been his son, Ellis, a boy with wide shoulders and wider ideals. They had fought a lot. Arthur wanted him to be cautious, but Ellis had volunteered for K-9 duty with a kind of fierce light in his chest. After the explosion, after the funeral, Arthur had closed his clinic and let the years take him quietly. He didn't believe in signs. Until now. Meanwhile, Mavis had taken on the role of silent orchestrator. She dropped off casseroles at Arthur's porch, never staying, but always leaving notes scribbled in loopy cursive. One afternoon, she handed Lila a small wooden box, the kind that smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. Inside were photographs, faded and curled, and a stack of letters tied with a red string. "That's Ellis," she said, pointing to a photo of a broad-shouldered young man in uniform, kneeling beside a younger, sharper Roan. "He was always smiling, drove me mad with those jokes of his." Lila turned the photo over. On the back was a single word, written in ink now almost invisible: Roan. The letters were harder to read. They were from Ellis to his mother, written during deployment, descriptions of sandstorms and late-night card games, mentions of the big guy who always slept at the foot of his cot. One letter, dated 2 weeks before his death, read, "Roan is more than a dog. He listens when no one else does. Maybe that's what heroes do. They just stay when others don't." Lila pressed the letter to her chest and held it there. One Saturday, as the afternoon light stretched long across the linoleum floors of Arthur's clinic, Lila came in with a bundle of supplies in her backpack, bandages, a cloth, and a small bottle of water mixed with salt. She knelt beside Roan, who now sat up more often, and gently began cleaning the healing wound along his leg. She spoke softly as she worked. "You're brave," she whispered, "even when you hurt." Arthur watched from the kitchen doorway. He didn't interrupt. Instead, He poured 2 mugs of tea, one for himself and one for Lila, and set them on the table with a nod. That afternoon, the three of them, an old vet, a silent girl, and a wounded dog, sat together for the first time without words. The room felt warmer than it had in years. Mavis joined them the next day, claiming she was just checking in, though she came with fresh cookies and a tin of old jigsaw puzzles. She sat in the armchair beside Lila, adjusted her shawl, and murmured, "I suppose none of us are as alone as we thought." Lila smiled and rested her hand on Roan's paw. He didn't flinch, and just like that, something unspoken began to grow between the four of them. Not a family, not yet, but a thread of trust stronger than blood. They didn't talk about the past, and they didn't dare imagine the future. But in those small, golden moments, over tea, puzzles, and dog stories, they were simply together. And for the first time in her life, Lila began to believe that maybe healing didn't always mean forgetting. Maybe it just meant being held, gently, by those who chose to stay. The photo was buried at the bottom of the wooden box, beneath yellowed letters and a service medal dulled by time. It wasn't much larger than a postcard, its edges frayed, the colors faded to soft sepia. But in the center stood a young man in fatigues, smiling with a warmth that seemed almost out of place against the backdrop of a barren desert. Beside him sat a younger version of Roan, sharper in stance, his coat sleek, his gaze intense. His ears were perfectly upright, and his body coiled like a spring even in stillness. The connection between them was unmistakable. Lila stared at the photograph for a long time, her fingers brushing across the worn surface as if to confirm what her heart already knew. This was Roan's person, his partner, his soldier. And now, a ghost carried only in images and memory. That night, she tucked the photo into the inside pocket of her coat, near her heart. She didn't tell Arthur or Mavis, not yet. The image wasn't just theirs anymore, it was hers too. Over the following weeks, something in Lila began to shift. She still came to Arthur's house every afternoon, still read to Roan and changed his dressings and spoke to him in that soft, steady tone she reserved only for him. But now, there was a new resolve in her movements. She sat taller, she laughed more, and she started wearing her hair pulled back in a neater ponytail, the way she imagined soldiers might prefer things, orderly, focused, ready. At school, teachers noticed. Her homeroom teacher, Miss Alvarez, a young woman with gentle eyes and a wardrobe full of warm scarves, called her to her desk one day. "You've been doing so well lately," she said. "I'm proud of you, Lila. Your writing has heart." Lila didn't know how to respond, but she smiled. Not the small, cautious smile she used to offer. This one reached her eyes. In the cafeteria, she sat closer to other children. She still didn't speak much, but she no longer recoiled when others looked at her or asked about her drawings. When a boy in her class leaned over and asked who the dog in her sketchbook was, she answered quietly, "My best friend." Roan, for his part, had begun to return to form. Though his limp remained, his steps had grown more confident and his eyes brighter. He followed Lila short distances now, out to the edge of Arthur's small backyard, to the side gate, even as far as the sidewalk when she left for school in the morning. He'd stop just before the pavement, sit, and wait until she disappeared from view. "You've made him young again," Arthur said one afternoon, watching the pair from the porch. "You and your stories." Arthur himself had changed, though not as noticeably. He still moved with the cautious discipline of an ex-soldier, but the way he watched Lila, how he kept a second cup of tea ready every day, how he started leaving the clinic door unlocked, spoke louder than anything he ever said aloud. It was Mavis, always sharper than she let on, who noticed first. "Something's different in you, child," she said, peering over the rim of her oversized glasses one afternoon, as Lila sat sorting puzzle pieces on the porch. "You're blooming." Lila didn't answer right away. Then quietly she said, "I think Roan misses him." "Ellis?" She nodded. Mavis sat down beside her with a slow creak of her joints, the shawl draped around her shoulders like a cape of winter. "He does. But he doesn't need to mourn forever. Dogs remember love the way we remember pain. He's lucky he found you," Lila whispered. "I'll stay with him, for both of us." At home, the change hadn't gone unnoticed. Sarah, still locked in the strange rhythm of her grief, had begun to see flickers of difference in her daughter, little things that caught the edges of her attention. Lila now brushed her hair without being told. She cleaned the kitchen table when crumbs scattered. She hummed softly when she thought no one was listening. Sarah Monroe was not a woman who had forgotten how to love, only one who had forgotten how to live in a world where love did not guarantee permanence. Her body was still thin, her skin pale, her eyes dulled from too many nights spent staring at her bedroom wall. But the sight of her daughter, glowing faintly in the golden light of late afternoon as she sat on the floor drawing a dog's profile, made something ache in her chest. She stood at the doorframe one evening, watching Lila press a crayon into the paper. "What are you drawing?" she asked, her voice rusted from disuse. Lila paused, surprised by the sound. Then she held up the picture, a sketch of Roan in front of a flag. "He's a soldier," she said. Sarah nodded, but didn't step closer. Later that night, she sat on the edge of her bed, holding a chipped coffee mug filled with cold water, staring out the window into the dark. She didn't understand this shift in Lila, not fully, but she recognized the pull of it, the way something had entered the space between them and cracked open a window. She didn't know how to crawl through it yet, but she also didn't close it. Lila, meanwhile, had made a decision. She visited the photo each night, unfolding it from her coat pocket and whispering promises to the man in the picture. She didn't know his voice. She didn't know his laugh. But she had seen the way he touched Roan's head, the calm in his eyes, and it felt like the memory of a father she'd never had. She was going to be what he would have wanted, someone brave, someone kind, someone who stayed. The wind began howling just after dusk. It started as a low moan threading through the eaves of houses along Elliott Street, then swelled into something wild and unrelenting. Branches clawed at windows, shingles rattled loose, and the trees bent like thin dancers caught mid-bough. Rain struck the roofs in bursts, sharp and unforgiving. Power flickered once, twice, then vanished entirely, plunging the street into a flickering darkness, pierced only by the occasional flash of lightning. Inside the pale blue house at the end of the street, Lila sat on the floor, surrounded by crayon sketches and half-finished drawings of Roan in various heroic poses, guarding gates, standing tall in a storm, resting beneath a tree. She had lit a small flashlight and propped it inside an empty glass, creating a soft orb of light that glowed like a lantern beside her. The silence in the house was heavier than usual. Sarah hadn't come out of her room all afternoon, not even when the weather sirens wailed briefly, warning of high winds. That wasn't unusual, but there had been something different in her eyes that morning, a fogged blankness that went deeper than her usual detachment. She hadn't spoken, only nodded when Lila placed a mug of warm tea outside the door. The tea remained untouched. Then, around 8 o'clock, Lila noticed the door was open. She stood in the hallway, barefoot on the cold floor, staring at the empty room. The blanket was folded, the lamp unplugged, the window wide open. Wind blew the curtains inward, water speckled the sill. On the nightstand, in trembling blue ink on a torn grocery receipt, were 6 crooked words. "I'm sorry, I can't stay anymore." Panic swallowed Lila's breath. She grabbed her coat, flashlight, and rain boots, bolting into the storm without thinking. The rain hit her like needles. The wind shoved her sideways. She staggered down the street, calling into the darkness, her voice lost in the roar. She checked behind the hedges. At Mrs. Calloway's porch. Even the Jenkins house. Though Roan wasn't there, he had taken to staying at Arthur's more often now, where it was warm and dry. Lila turned toward the woods behind the neighborhood, a patch of trees no one liked to talk about, tangled and overgrown, where shadows stayed longer than they should. She hesitated, then ran. The forest swallowed her whole. The trees were tall and swaying violently, their branches snapping like brittle bones. The path was mud, thick and clinging. Lila slipped once, twice, falling to her knees, clawing her way forward with shaking hands. She cried out for her mother again and again, voice cracking. A flash of lightning illuminated a gnarled root, and before she could stop herself, her foot caught, and she tumbled into a low thicket of thorn bush and underbrush. The branches wrapped around her, thorns slicing her coat, her palms. She gasped, trying to push herself up, but her foot was stuck. Every tug sent a sharp pain through her ankle. She was alone, completely. And then, far off, something moved. Roan had felt it the moment she ran. Even though his hind legs still bore the memory of injury, even though Arthur had been gently scolding him for putting too much weight on it, He had stood the moment the back door opened, and the wind carried Lila's scent. Fear, salt, urgency. Arthur had been sitting by the fireplace with a mug of chamomile, the night heavy with its own memories. When Roan growled low in his chest and limped to the door, Arthur followed. Outside, the storm was in full fury. Roan pushed through it like an animal possessed, his wet coat pressed flat against his ribs, his ears pinned. He moved with a lurching determination, his nose low to the ground, following a scent trail already washing away in the rain. Arthur called after him once, then turned back inside to grab his coat, keys, and flashlight. 10 minutes later, he was at Mavis's front porch, soaked through and grim-faced. "She's gone," he said simply. "Lila ran out in the storm. I think Sarah's missing too." Mavis didn't hesitate. She emerged moments later in thick rubber boots and a wool coat buttoned up to her neck, flashlight in hand. She didn't say a word, just climbed into Arthur's truck with him and slammed the door. They drove slowly through the wind, the wipers struggling against the sheets of rain, calling Lila's name through the open window. Mavis scanned ditches, backyards, porches. Arthur's hands gripped the steering wheel tight, his jaw clenched. "You think she went toward the woods?" Mavis asked. Arthur nodded grimly. "That's where she'd go. She's not looking for shelter. She's looking for her mother." Meanwhile, deep inside the trees, Lila's voice was fading. Her hands were scraped and trembling, her hair plastered to her face. She couldn't feel her toes. The wind howled louder here, the trees creaking and groaning above, and then he appeared. Not with noise, not with barking, but with heat and breath and presence. Roan pushed through the bushes with brute force, his chest heaving, mud caked to his belly. His eyes locked on Lila instantly. She began to sob. "Roan," she whispered, trying to move. He stepped over the brush slowly, nudging her with his head, then laying his body beside her like a wall of warmth. She buried her fingers into his wet fur, clinging. "I can't move," she murmured. "My ankle. I think it's stuck." Lightning cracked overhead, a tree grown nearby, its trunk shifting in the soaked earth. Roan's ears perked, a deep rumble, a snap. The tree came down fast. Roan shifted without hesitation, curling his body over Lila as the branch shattered across the thicket. He didn't cry out, didn't flinch, just took the weight of it with his back as debris crashed down around them. The main trunk missed them by inches. The rest hit hard. Lila screamed, but not in pain, in terror. For him. She couldn't see if he was breathing. And then, headlights, footsteps, flashlights cutting through the dark. Arthur's voice roared into the clearing. "Lila!" she called back weakly. Arthur and Mavis reached her in seconds. Mavis dropped to her knees, checking her for injuries. Arthur bent to Roan, brushing broken limbs aside, then exhaled sharply. "He's alive!" Carefully, they freed Lila from the thorns and Roan from the debris. Arthur carried the girl in his arms, Mavis holding the flashlight high. Roan followed, limping badly, but upright. Back at the house, wrapped in blankets and tucked into Arthur's worn recliner, Lila stared at the dog sleeping near the fire. "He found me," she said hoarsely. "He protected me, like always." Mavis, wiping a cut on Lila's cheek, murmured, "He's more than a dog." Arthur sat heavily on the couch, watching the storm finally begin to fade through the windows. "He's family," he said. And in the quiet that followed, none of them needed to say anything more. Morning came slow and pale after the storm. A washed-out sky stretched over Eugene like a breath held too long. The clouds lingered, low and reluctant, and everything on Elliott Street seemed quieter than usual, sobered, as if the world itself were nursing a bruise. In Arthur's clinic, the small back room smelled faintly of antiseptic and damp wool. Lila sat curled in a blanket on the floor beside Roan, her hand resting gently on his paw. The dog lay motionless, save for the rise and fall of his chest, shallow, irregular. His back bore a long scrape where the branch had struck, and his breathing had become strained. Every few minutes, he gave a low, gravelly whimper. Arthur watched from the doorway, his arms crossed tightly, his brows furrowed deeper than usual. He hadn't slept. Mavis had left just before dawn, promising to return with soup and fresh bandages. The storm had shaken them all, but it had taken something more from Roan. Even without touching him, Arthur could see the damage, internal, deep, hidden in the soft tissue and time-worn joints. Roan's body was no longer a battleground. It was a map of long campaigns, of too many sacrifices and too few chances to rest. By mid-morning, Arthur called in a favor. Dr. Ruth Cantwell, a veterinarian in her early 50s with short-cropped silver hair and a practical manner, arrived just after 11. She wore a navy blue raincoat and carried a leather case worn at the corners. Her face, calm but serious, softened slightly when she saw Lila. She crouched beside Roan, carefully examining the dog's vitals, lifting his eyelids, pressing gently around the ribs and legs. Roan didn't resist. He didn't even flinch. His eyes barely opened. Ruth stood slowly and stepped into the hallway with Arthur. Lila remained inside, running a damp cloth across Roan's forehead, the way she'd seen people care for fevered children in books. "His lungs are weak," Ruth said quietly. "He's in pain, Arthur. The muscle strain is severe, and there may be internal bleeding. His age is against him. I can ease it, help him go gently. It's the kindest thing we can offer sometimes." Arthur stared at her, unmoving. "You know that," she added. He did, but he didn't answer. Inside, Lila looked up and saw them through the half-open door. She didn't need to hear. She could see it on Ruth's face, see the careful sadness behind the professional calm. She stood. "Please don't," she said, her voice dry and cracking. "Please don't take him." Ruth hesitated. "Sweetheart," Lila stepped forward, eyes locked on Arthur now. "If he can't guard the gate anymore," she said, barely above a whisper, "then I'll do it. I'll keep watch. But he has to stay." Her voice broke. "I don't care if he can't run or chase things. He's not here to do tricks. He's here because I need him, and because he chose me." Arthur's eyes flickered. Something caught, then cracked beneath the years. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth exhaled gently and touched Arthur's arm. "I'll leave you two," she said. "Call me if you need anything." She gave Lila a small, warm nod before she left, but it was Arthur who spoke next. "I told myself I wouldn't do surgery again," he said, staring at the floor. "Not after Ellis, not after everything." He glanced at Roan, then at Lila. "But maybe this isn't about me anymore." He moved with purpose then, pulling down the old cabinet with the surgical tools, disinfecting the small table, heating the lights. He didn't have a team. He didn't have modern equipment. But he had steady hands, and this time he had reason. The surgery lasted over 2 hours. Lila sat outside the closed door with her head resting against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. Mavis returned halfway through, bringing tea and a peanut butter sandwich that Lila couldn't eat. "He's strong," Mavis whispered. "So is Arthur. They're both stubborn as mules." When the door finally opened, Arthur looked older, but also lighter, like a man who had finally let go of something too heavy. "He made it," he said simply. Lila threw herself into his arms. Roan's recovery was slow but sure. The days passed in quiet rituals. Lila arrived every morning before school and every afternoon after. She read aloud, told him stories, massaged his joints with warm cloths, and helped him stand a little longer each day. Arthur guided her through the process with patient instruction: how to clean the wound, how to check for swelling, how to wrap the new bandages with just the right pressure. Roan never whined. He watched her with tired but clear eyes, his tail thudding softly whenever she walked in the room. His body was weaker now. He'd never run full stride again. But he was here, still choosing to stay. One Sunday morning, while Lila was sketching Roan in his new bed by the fireplace, Arthur sat beside her with a cup of coffee. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "maybe it's time we all stopped living alone." She looked up. "I've got space," he added. "This place is too quiet without someone humming all the time. Mavis says you hum in your sleep." Lila smiled. "I don't." "She says you do." They looked at each other, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt like she belonged. A week later, with Mavis's blessing and Sarah still gone without word, Arthur filed the papers to become Lila's temporary guardian. It wasn't official, not yet. But Lila brought over her clothes, her sketchbooks, and the old photograph of Ellis and Roan. She placed it on the mantelpiece beside a carved wooden box filled with Ellis's medals, which Arthur hadn't touched in years. The three of them, Arthur, Lila, and Roan, fell into a rhythm. On cold nights they sat by the fire. On warm days they walked slowly through the garden behind the house, Roan limping gently at Lila's side. Mavis visited often, always with stories, always with laughter that filled the corners of the house like sunlight, and no one mentioned the missing mother. Not yet. Not until the time was right. For now, what mattered was that Roan had stayed, and that a girl who had once walked home alone now walked with someone beside her, older, slower, and filled with more love than she'd ever been taught to expect. Spring in Eugene arrived like a sigh after a long-held breath. The trees, once bare and clawing toward the sky, began to wear their green again. Daffodils bloomed in quiet corners. Rain still came, but it was softer now, a gentle tapping on the rooftops instead of the wild, pounding storms of winter. In Arthur's garden, birds returned. Sparrows, robins, and once a red cardinal that Lila swore Roan had sent to check on them. Life had settled into something resembling peace. Arthur's house, once a mausoleum of silence, now held warmth in every corner. The fireplace rarely burned anymore, but laughter echoed in the kitchen. Mavis visited daily, often with puzzles, muffins, or old war stories that blended fact with affectionate exaggeration. Lila, now visibly taller, stronger, wore her hair tied with a ribbon instead of an elastic band. Her drawings had changed too, less black ink, more color. And Roan, older than anyone could really guess, had grown slower. He no longer followed her past the garden. He mostly lay by the porch or the back door, watching. His eyes, still the same deep gold, had faded at the edges, and his breath came in slower rhythms. His body, once lean and taut with muscle, had softened into age. The limp remained, but he no longer seemed to mind. He moved when he had to, but mostly, he simply stayed. Lila knew. She saw it in the way he no longer rose to meet her, but only lifted his head when she approached. She felt it in the heaviness of his sleep, in the long pauses between his sighs. There were no dramatic signs, no cries or pain, just a quiet, steady dimming. One morning, she rose early. The air was damp but warm, and the sky was a canvas of soft gray. She pulled on her rain boots, grabbed a biscuit from the kitchen, and stepped outside into the dew-laced yard. Roan wasn't at his usual spot by the kitchen steps. She looked around the garden. Nothing. Then she walked toward the front yard, past the crooked gate with the squeaky hinge, the one they never fully fixed. And there, at the edge of the walkway, curled in the grass where they had first met, Roan lay still. His body was peaceful, his head resting on his front paws, eyes closed as if in the middle of a dream. Lila stood for a moment, frozen in the hush of morning. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she sat beside him, folding her legs beneath her hand reaching to stroke the spot just behind his ear, the one that always made him sigh. Arthur found her there not long after. He had seen the empty bed, heard the silence, and known. He didn't speak as he knelt beside her. He simply laid a gentle hand on her shoulder and let her lean against him. They buried him under the old willow tree in the front yard, the one Roan had spent hours watching, even when there was nothing moving beneath it. Arthur built a simple wooden marker, polished and carved with careful hands. At Lila's request, they etched the words together. Here lies Roan, the gatekeeper of broken hearts. The neighborhood came by that evening, quietly, in twos and threes. Mavis brought daisies and placed them beside the marker. Mrs. Calloway, who had once scolded Lila for feeding a stray, brought a candle. Even Mr. Tilden came, silent and respectful. No speeches were made, no prayers spoken. Just silence and the wind in the willow branches. Weeks passed. At school, Lila sat at the front of her class in the small sunlit library. The shelves behind her were filled with books that smelled of ink and dust and possibility. Miss Alvarez had invited her to speak during Story Day, a tradition where students shared their favorite tales or personal memories. Lila stood in front of her classmates, back straight, chin up, voice steady. She didn't bring a book. Instead, she held a worn drawing, the first sketch she had ever made of Roan. Then she began to speak. She told them about the gate, the silence, and the dog who never barked, about peanut butter sandwiches and broken legs, about a storm, a thicket of thorns, and a body that shielded hers from falling trees, about a quiet old man with strong hands and a heart cracked open by a photograph, about a woman who watched from her porch and believed in dogs that remember love better than people. She spoke of loneliness and how it changes when someone simply stays. She ended with Roan's name. When she was done, the room was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom, but the kind that feels like listening. Then one student clapped, then another, then the entire room filled with soft applause. Not loud, not showy, but real. Miss Alvarez smiled, her eyes glistening. Afterward, Lila folded the drawing back into her pocket and returned to her seat. She looked out the window. The willow swayed slightly in the wind, and for just a second, she imagined she could see him there, just beyond the trees, standing tall at the gate once more. At home, Arthur made pancakes for dinner, slightly burnt but stacked high. Mavis came by with strawberry jam. They played a slow board game none of them fully understood. Lila laughed until she hiccuped, and that night, before bed, she whispered into her pillow, "I'll keep the gate now." Later that week, a letter arrived, postmarked from a clinic several towns away. Sarah, she had checked herself into a long-term treatment center after the storm. She was getting help, learning to be whole again. The handwriting was shakier than before, but the words were clearer. "Tell Lila I'm not gone. I'm just learning how to come back. And thank Roan for keeping her heart open." Lila held the letter for a long time, then she folded it and placed it beneath the carved wooden box on the mantel. Not every story ends in perfect circles, but sometimes they end where they're meant to, with a girl who learned how to be brave, a dog who never gave up, and a family stitched together not by blood, but by love, loss, and loyalty. And a gate, still standing, watched now by smaller hands, just as steady. Sometimes, the miracles we pray for don't arrive with thunder or light. They come on 4 tired legs, with golden eyes and a heart that simply refuses to leave us alone in the dark. Roan didn't have to speak. He didn't have to rescue anyone from fire or fame. He just stayed. And in a world where so many walk away, staying can be the greatest act of love. Maybe that's how God works too. Not always through angels with wings, but through old dogs, kind neighbors, a warm hand, a second chance. If you've ever felt forgotten, overlooked, or broken, just know this: you are still seen, still held, still worthy of a miracle. May God bless those who watch over others, and may He bless you too for being here to hear this story. If this touched your heart, don't forget to comment your thoughts, share this story, and subscribe for more tales of hope, healing, and the quiet ways love finds us.